So to continue that narrative then, travel travel gave rise to sort of these proto-anthropologists. Travel also gave rise to the earliest social scientists in the 1700s, people like Locke and Rousseau. Really not social scientists, but social theorists, people thinking about society and its origins and how it had changed over time. And then by the 1800s, we start to see the birth of really people starting to call themselves anthropologists or sociologists or other things and kind of doing something more like what we think of as anthropology today. Oftentimes, they were doing a lot more ethnology, though, than ethnography, and that's a huge difference. So what I mean by that is, instead of going and writing about a specific culture, they were doing a lot of, let's compare 10 cultures or 20 cultures or 30 cultures. They would draw from a missionary's account of life among the Wendat or the Huron with, a colonial administrator's account of Aboriginal Australian religious life, and then compare that to what, Marco Polo had written a couple hundred years ago about a Chinese village that he was in. And then they'll compare that to what some British guy wrote about his travels through what we now think of as Kenya, right? They're drawing together all these different accounts, or maybe sometimes it's even more direct. They're like writing to it seems to always be missionaries or colonial administrators or explorers, but write to some European that's living in, let's say, Thailand and say, hey, could you look around the village where you're staying at and like look for if people do these kinds of customs? Because I'm curious about that. I'm writing a book about that. So anyways, they were kind of, we call this the age of armchair anthropology, which is not always 100% fair, but it is because there were people like Lewis Henry Morgan who were doing a little bit of like actually spending time with people, with groups of people. But generally what was happening here was that, people were in their armchairs, so to speak. They're back home in Europe or perhaps the Eastern United States, writing huge sort of social scientific theories about humans and about how our societies develop, drawing on the observations of other people in far off places. As you can imagine, there's a lot of weaknesses to that approach, not the least of which is it relies on the accounts of explorers and missionaries as being accurate, and certainly sometimes they weren't, right? Not just because they were filtered through prejudicial lenses very often, but also because even when they weren't, you had a lot of people that weren't really trained to think scientifically or systematically about society. So they were bringing in their ethnocentrism, they were missing details that were relevant, they didn't know what they were looking for. So the data, right? If you've ever heard of like coding, computer coding, like garbage in, garbage out, right? You need you need good stuff coming in to have good stuff coming out. And in a similar way, data wasn't always very good, but sometimes it was good data. Perhaps a bigger issue is that when you don't spend time with human societies as an anthropologist and then try to write anthropology, you may not have a good, what I'll call anthropological humility, or the ability to recognize that situations on the ground are always more complicated than how we write about them, right? They're always very messy, and that we then have to try to make a generalization, but we have to recognize that that's what we're doing, right? That we're trying to generalize complexity. And if you've never been to those cultures, you maybe don't realize that. So some of the ways that people wrote about cultures showed that they had never really done fieldwork and they didn't really understand what fieldwork was like. And they were also kind of misusing the data, kind of cherry picking, right? It's easy when you've got the whole world of examples to draw on to pick the ones that most easily fit your narrative and then be like, bada bing, it proves my theory. So there were issues with armchair anthropology. Though it was used by some of our earliest sort of founding theorists, people like Edward Tyler, people like Karl Marx, who didn't really call himself an anthropologist and who some people would not want to claim, but he was a very early sort of economic historian in addition to his political writings, and they were kind of intertwined with each other, right? So he had his theories that influenced early social sciences, Emil Durkheim, who went in a very different direction than Marx, Max Weber, and then Lewis Henry Morgan, who wrote a lot of our earliest sort of American anthropology. These men, and yes, you'll notice a common denominator here that these earliest 1800s anthropologists were generally men and were generally white. These men, though, also typically middle class, right? They had enough sort of economic wherewithal, either middle or upper class, that they could afford to like do a job that at the time wasn't really a paid job, which was just writing about other people's cultures. Anyways, these relatively privileged men started writing about this stuff from their armchairs, drawing on the travels of others, not necessarily doing a lot of their own travels. It is perhaps partly for that reason, and partly because of the sort of biases of the time, where Europeans tended to think of themselves as sort of peak human civilization, that we then got many of them landing on one version or another of what we think of as social evolution, and especially unilineal social evolution. Unilineal social evolution, as we call it nowadays, is the idea, the disproven idea, very much disproven at this point. We almost had 2 centuries now disproving it, or at least a century and a half. But anyways, the idea that was popular in the 1800s among scholars, um, that societies moved through predictable stages. That just like you can predict how forest grows from a grassland to a shrubland to kind of more of a deciduous small forest to like a large mature pine, spruce forest or something like that, just as you can predict nature in that way, that you can predict how human societies will grow and evolve over time. Sometimes this would be described as savagery, barbarism, civilization, right? And when you look at the different characteristics they were using, it's then not terribly shocking that they put characteristics on the top that were characteristic of European and to some degree Eastern Asian societies, right? And also some of the Middle Eastern empires they were most familiar with. They basically chose the most powerful nations, particularly themselves, said that was the peak of civilization, and then sort of judged everything else as lower tier versions of that. Um, which, interestingly, people like Lewis Henry Morgan were making those kind of what we would say now is very racist sort of hierarchical ideas at the same time as they were doing things like going to court to defend native land rights in the case of Lewis Henry Morgan, because he really had a lot of connections with the Haudenosaunee community in New York. It was a weird, complicated and contradictory time as anthropology was being born. So some of the ideas these early scholars came up with, such as Durkheim's idea about social effervescence, were fascinating and still have a lot of validity today. The idea of unilineal social evolution, though, is one that we've really kind of thrown by the wayside, partly because it's easy to see that if you already think Europe is the best, and then if you are kind of cherry picking data from a lot of different sources around the world. But if you actually go and spend time with cultures, actually travel there, suddenly this whole sort of schema, this whole sort of hierarchy starts to break down. For example, let's say you were to actually go and spend time with Inupiat people in the far northern tundra and start to realize that their way of life is traditionally was an extremely well adapted way to surviving life in the Arctic that many Europeans at the time really struggled to do. You start to say, wow, what is the actual criteria we're using to rank hierarchy here? For that matter, just speaking to people, the act of not just reading about people from what an explorer wrote, but actually speaking to people firsthand really starts to make you question your own sort of superiority, right? So there's a power in travel that these men, for a variety of reasons, weren't really using yet. But then once travel became a part of what anthropologists did, suddenly things started changing dramatically. By the way, I put a note here at the end. When we say armchair anthropology, sometimes people, you could argue that some things nowadays are armchair anthropology. Something like this book that I was just saying is so awesome, Dawn of Everything, in the sense that both of those scholars have done good research with different communities, but most of what they're writing about is other people's research. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That can be a really good thing to draw on others' research. The problem is that a lot of these early anthropologists had never done any research of their own, and so they were coming at it with a lot of biases that research kind of pounds out of you, which brings up the point that for anthropologists, this is a weird quirk of our discipline, that a field work, a going out and spending time in a community, probably for months, if not years, is often treated, at least for academics, but sometimes also for more applied anthropologists, is kind of treated like a rite of passage. It's become a lot less so over the years, but that was historically the case for many generations, that anthropologists viewed going out into the field for a long time as kind of a rite of passage. And you can kind of see why based on this, right? Because we see what happens when people don't travel and try to write anthropology, when they only base it off their ideas of things that they're reading in books that people have sent back. Okay. All of this brings us to the rise of fieldwork. So we shift from armchair anthropology where you like are collecting tons of writings of different people and making broad theories about humanity, to suddenly people writing really, really detailed accounts, for example, of Zuni ceremonial songs that take up hundreds of pages and are incredibly detailed and even have these great conversations with Zuni people. This is like night and day different almost. It's a totally different approach to anthropology. It's the rise of fieldwork as we know it. People will often say that Malinowski invented fieldwork, and as you can see, I've got a bit of a bone to pick with Malinowski. Um, he certainly wrote about fieldwork. He wrote about something that other people were already doing, and he wrote about it in a very cohesive, compelling, persuasive way of like why this was a good technique. And in so doing, has done what a lot of people from sort of Malcolm Gladwell to Jared Diamond do, which is take ideas of other people, synthesize them into a very readable version, and then become quite popular as a result. So and I'm not saying that's good or bad, that's just something that happens when many people are thinking about the same idea, but then one person finds a way to like really sell it to the public. They sometimes are the one that gets their name in the history books or gets well known and their books sell a lot of books. So Malinowski he didn't really pioneer fieldwork. He did have a fascinating story of how he got sort of trapped into fieldwork. And he said he wrote a lot about his experience, and that helped inspire a lot of later anthropologists about why fieldwork was a really useful thing. The other thing that was kind of different for Malinowski is just how long he was there. He was there several years, basically, as World War I was happening, and he was basically stuck in the Trobriand Islands. And he made a case that not just, a few weeks, as a lot of anthropologists had done up to that point, but like actual years in a place could be really beneficial. Now, the reality is most of us cannot spend years doing fieldwork, even in graduate school, which is in theory when we should be doing it. Um, and that's okay, but that was kind of the model for a while in a kind of a simpler time period when that was more feasible for a lot of people. Nowadays, most people, for a variety of reasons, would not have the money to do that. Um, at the time, it was often being funded by the government, among other things, which is one of the reasons why um, people could do things like that, go and spend years in a place doing fieldwork. So anyways, there was Malinowski, but even like 30 or 40 years before Malinowski, there was a bunch of people doing fieldwork under what's called the Bureau of American Ethnology. They would travel like any other tourist, hop on a train, follow the train from the eastern seaboard all the way into the Southwest, hop off at the end of the railroad, but then go and like spend time in, let's say, various Native American reservations and studying cultures. This was at the time of salvage ethnography, where the idea was very much to record as much as could be possible before it disappeared. We now know that that's not how cultures work, and that those cultures, by and large, did not disappear. Cultures change and evolve and adapt, even under extraordinary stress. However, at the time, that's how they were thinking of it, was salvage ethnography. Anyways, it's in that space that you started to have people who would spend weeks, if not months, and then in at least one notable case, which is Frank Cushing with the Zuni, actual years spending time with the community and then writing about it. I have a picture here of Frank Cushing. I have a picture of Gladys Reichard, who's another early one who did great work with Navajo people that was very much more honest than a lot of the other work being done. She didn't try to write like an objective scientist in some of her works. She tried to write really personally in some of them, although others were more objective sounding. She was a cool writer. You have Alice Fletcher, who's got a really complex history because she has views that nowadays we would say were very colonial, but at the same time would have viewed herself as an advocate for Native Americans. And indeed, in the court case for one of the Lakota chiefs that was imprisoned, she came out on the side of his civil rights and tried to defend him. She's a complicated person that believed in a lot of things that nowadays I personally find very deeply offensive, but that would have viewed herself as a good anthropologist. Anyway, she was doing fieldwork and writing about it. Cushing was. You start to see this rise of fieldwork. Oh, the reason I have the eagle here, by the way, is just to point, because I like wrote the PowerPoint slide first and I was like, oh, Malinowski, you think you invented fieldwork, but Americans invented it 40 years earlier, you British guy. So that's why I've got like the American flag there. Anyways, bye, bald eagle. Obviously, as this should make clear, there's a lot of complex relationships going on here as people are traveling to these lands, because typically they're traveling to lands that have already been colonized. As Cushing and Fletcher's example shows, as Malinowski's example shows, typically they were traveling to places that were either already colonized or actively in the process of being drawn into colonialism. So that raises a lot of issues. It raises, among other things, sort of ethical issues of how some of our early anthropological forebears did do fascinating research, but often were only able to get into those spaces because the place was already colonized or being colonized, which is deeply problematic. Um, so there's complex relationships there. Sometimes, I might add,